My baby dolls, we're back again with another episode of Genesis. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and today we have a really great show coming in store for you folks. We got Glenn Stout and his really fantastic, well-researched, well-documented book on the selling of the Babe. That's Babe Ruth. And the deal that changed baseball and created a legend. And I know what you're thinking. There's been hundreds of books written about Babe Ruth. But as we're going to find out when we speak to Glenn in about another 5 minutes, his research produced material that has never been talked about before. It busts a lot of myths that happened throughout the years about the whole selling of Babe Ruth. And it's really a book you guys and gals have to pick up because it's going to shed a lot of light on probably, the biggest deal that ever happened in baseball. As always, you are listening to my show, Genesis, on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho. He is the producer. And this book, it was published last year. And Glenn has written, he's either edited or been a ghostwriter, or he just loves to write, over 90 books, including Fenway 1912, Red Sox Century, Yankees Century. He's done a ton of work on baseball. He's also the editor for the Best American Sports Writing and a Casey Award finalist, author of such titles as Red Sox Century, Yankee Century, and Fenway 1912, like I mentioned. And without any further ado, please welcome to the show, Glenn Stout.
Thank you very much.
Now let me ask you something. The Babe, why did you say, hey, I got to do the Babe, when, like I mentioned earlier in my segment, there's been like countless amount of material written about him.
Right. Well, a couple of reasons. One is that, I'd had kind of an alternate take on the sale of Ruth for about 20 years. I first wrote about it in the late 1980s and started to realize that the whole Curse of the Bambino story it's a nice hook, but it's not real history. I finally got a chance to write about it in depth in both Red Sox Century and Yankees Century, and kind of thought I was done with the story, that I'd broken a lot of new ground and I would let other people carry it forward. And quite frankly, that just never happened. Nobody really carried the story forward in the way I thought they should. So I decided to approach it again. In the meantime, some additional historical documents became available that had not been available to me. Hey, dog barking here. Sorry about that. Became available that had not been available to me initially, primarily the Harry Frazee Archive, which is held by the University of Texas in Austin. And, so I decided I would approach it again and try to make use of some of this new research. And then just as a figure, I don't think Babe Ruth had ever been written about in full dimension. And by that I mean we got a lot about what he'd done. We knew a lot about his background. But, the one thing that had always struck me with him is that, he was a problematic player. He was a great player, but he was problematic as a person. And that had never really been looked at as closely as it should have been, I didn't think. And then you couple that with the fact that this transition in his career that took place from being a pitcher to being a hitter took place right as the dead ball era ended and the lively ball era commenced, and Ruth is at the center of that transformation. And no one had ever really written a book that talked about that transitional period between the dead ball era and the lively ball era. So, the selling of the Babe is not just the selling of the Babe in terms of the deal in which he was sold from the Red Sox to the Yankees, but also the selling of this new game to the American people. A new game based on the home run.
And let me ask you this. If we take the listeners back to 1919, World War I has just ended, and of course you have the Black Sox scandal, and you have Judge Landis coming in as a commissioner of baseball. But did they do something different with the ball to make it more livelier?
Well, they did, but it was not so much on purpose as it was as a product of the war. I mean, what happened during the tail end of World War I is that the government took the highest grade horsehide to make military equipment. They took the highest grade wool to make military uniforms, and that left baseball with an inferior product to make baseballs out of. So the dead ball that was being used became even deader. Well, they kind of realized this, that this was happening. So what they did in response was to wind the yarn tighter to kind of offset the degrading of material. Coming out of the war, back into 1919, when they had access to better wool, better horsehide again, is that they never bothered to change the winding back. So sort of by accident, you had a ball that was suddenly somewhat livelier, but at the same time you had a hitter in Babe Ruth who sort of purely by chance was taking a different approach to hitting. And when you took that different approach to hitting and he started appearing at bat more than he did on the pitcher's mound and suddenly started hitting home runs, he made that change apparent. And had he not come up with this new style of hitting, he was swinging from the heels. He wasn't pushing at the ball. He wasn't trying to place the ball. Had there not been a player like Ruth, it might have taken years for that change to take place. Ruth was the right guy at the right time who was already swinging the bat in a different way, and when the balls became livelier again, he was poised to take advantage of that. And in his wake, then so were a lot of other people who looked at Ruth rather than a guy like Ty Cobb as someone to model the way they hit the baseball after.
Because I think Honus Wagner and Ty Cobb said that it was a misnomer that the ball became livelier, because I think there's two reasons. One you mentioned, which was Ruth's different approach. Instead of slapping the ball, now his hands are all the way down at the bat, swinging for the fences. But also, they got rid of using one ball a game, which of course it was the
right.
ball.
Right, that's in the wake of the Ray Chapman incident.
Yeah.
Where, Carl Mays threw the pitch that killed, and Ray Chapman was hit by a ball, fractured his skull, and killed him. And because before then they tended to use the same ball as long as they could. It got not just softer over the course of the game, but darker, because it would get grass marks on it, would get dirty, and people would, quite frankly, spit tobacco juice on it. So the ball would become much, much darker. And as a safety reason, they started inserting newer baseballs more often. So that certainly contributed too. But it wasn't a nefarious plan. It wasn't like baseball sat down and said, the Black Sox scandal has happened, we need to do something. Because the Black Sox scandal really didn't start to be revealed until 1920. And the lively ball was already in place then. It was circumstantial, and a good thing, because, baseball in the teens in this country was starting to die off a little bit. The number of minor league teams from 1910 to 1919 went from, I think, 50 to 10. The number of minor league leagues went from 50 to 10. Attendance dropped almost by half in the major leagues. And, there was a real question as to whether baseball was going to survive. It was a somewhat of a dull, boring game. Scientific baseball ruled. You squeezed out runs by the hit and run and the bunt and the sacrifice. And it wasn't drawing younger fans anymore. So in the wake of World War I and the Spanish influenza, which killed millions in this country, you had a new generation that was ready for something new, and the home run gave them something brand new.
And let me ask you this: how we spoke that you had this formulating for 20 years, but when you sat down to piece all this together and do the research, how long did it take to do all the research? Because you traveled, like you mentioned, to Texas. You went to the Harry Ransom Center, and you got archives that you were looking at microfiche like they did back in the 80s and 70s, besides just looking online.
Sure. I mean, in a way, I've been doing the research for over 20 years because I've been doing sports history and baseball history for a long time, and for that era, that primarily lives in the old newspapers, in the microfilm. And years ago, I worked at the Boston Public Library, became very, very familiar with that, and realized I was one of the few people that was actually putting in the time to do that kind of research. So I'd accumulated a lot before I started this specific project, but I knew the Frazee archives existed. I knew I really needed to take a close look at those. And, I go into every project with the assumption that I don't know anything. So, for instance, all the stuff about the dead ball and lively ball and that transitional period and the style of hitting of Ruth and baseball losing its popularity, that was not stuff that was in the forefront of my mind when I started this project. But as I dive into the research, I just follow the truth. I follow what happens. One of the lessons I try to give younger writers is that the truth always tells the best story. So when I encounter things that run counter to the kind of accepted story or the myths that exist, I pay attention to that, and I follow that because that's how you uncover new information. And I don't always know when I start that that's going to be the result. But I've been doing this long enough now that I do realize that when I dig in from a research perspective, that almost without fail, I will come up with new things simply because no one else has ever looked as hard as I have. I'll give an example of that with Harry Frazee, the Red Sox owner. He'd been presented for years as kind of this failed theatrical producer, and no one had ever really looked at his theater career. Well, when I did Red Sox Century, now almost 20 years ago, 15 years ago anyway, I looked at him very closely as a theatrical producer, and lo and behold, uncovered the fact that he wasn't this failure. He was one of the great successes of his era. That he'd had a number of hits before the infamous No No Nanette. That he was actually, one of the giants of Broadway during the golden age of Broadway. So that led me to look at him in a different way than other people had looked at him, who'd looked at him primarily as a baseball owner. Baseball was a sidelight for him. It wasn't his number one job. He was a theater guy, and a very, very, very successful one. So, that led me to see him in a different light. And when you see that he'd had these successes in the theater, not only before he bought the Red Sox, but while he owned the Red Sox, and even after he'd sold Ruth, it forces you to look at the deal in a totally different perspective.
Let me ask you this: do you have any regrets for leaving anything out? Because your research had to have been massive, and the book is only 240 pages.
Right,
so,
right.
Did you leave that?
Well, that's one of the reasons why I confined it to basically from 1918 to 1920. If you look at the other books that have been done about Ruth, and there's some very, very good ones, but they tended to be comprehensive histories of Ruth, comprehensive biographies of Ruth. They tended to overlook that transitional period, like in the Robert Creamer book. That's dealt with in just a handful of pages. So I've learned over time too that when I can confine a story to a smaller period of time, like I did with Fenway 1912, I told the history of Fenway Park by looking at it over its first season, rather than trying to tell the history of Fenway Park over, over 100 years. I did it in a confined space. And when you do that, you just get into a depth that these more comprehensive surveys simply can't get to. I mean, I would love to, to take another deep dive into Ruth sometime, for another confined period in his career. I think that'd be, really, really interesting. I mean, I stopped this book, at the end of the 1920 season, and, no one has really just looked at Ruth purely, during the championship years of the Yankees, or, the kind of the assumption is he joined the Yankees and they were instantly a dynasty. Well, that's not true either. It took a few years for that to get traction. They were certainly a much better team, but it's not like Ruth joined them and they won the World Series year after year after year after year. It took a while for the team to kind of catch up with him, for the team to kind of realize, and for other teams in baseball to realize that this was a new game and to take advantage of that. So I think any time you take a figure like Ruth and you can confine their story to a shorter period of time, you're going to find something new. You're going to bring a different perspective to him. And Ruth is one of those people who is inexhaustible. You're never going to tell his full story, and no book is ever going to tell his full story. So that's kind of the approach that I take when I go into these projects.
It's funny you mention that, because I'm reading now Paul Dixon's new book on Leo DeRocha, and in it, Babe Ruth was a coach for a few months for the Dodgers. People don't know that, but even with
DeRocha, I think you could make a whole book on DeRocha just about the transitional period when Jackie Robinson joined that team, because of course DeRocha gets suspended.
Right.
And that's a fascinating time period. And like I said, I know Paul's book, is a survey history, a full biography of DeRocha, but you could do a full book on DeRocha just over about that 2-year period when he gets suspended and when Robinson comes to the big leagues. There's certainly enough there then, and if you were to do that, you would probably uncover all this new stuff about DeRocha that, in all likelihood, isn't touched on very much in a larger survey biography.
And what's also interesting? I was speaking with a couple of authors, like yourself. I was speaking to Peter Golenbach, and he said, Ian, you have the dead ball era, and you always say, well, the dead ball era to me is probably the most important time in baseball history, right up to the point where Ruth gets traded. To me, the dead ball era shaped modern baseball. But a lot of people forget 1919, I believe, Tris Speaker and Ty Cobb bet on the game, and there's never been a book written about that.
Right.
About and
those incidents in their biographies get set aside as a couple of paragraphs or a couple of pages. And you're absolutely right. There was so much written at that time. You have to remember that during the time period you're talking about, that most of these cities, major league cities, had 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 daily newspapers, all reporting on these things every single day. And one of the things I do is I don't just look at the obvious newspapers, the New York Times, the Boston Globe. I look at those other papers, many of which don't exist anymore, the Boston Post, the Boston Herald American, papers like that. And in that way, you get to layer the history, you get to another level of detail, and you find more information. You had the Sporting News reporting all this stuff that was going on in depth, every week or two. It's almost like a bottomless pit. You can get lost in it, and I think that explains to some degree why some other writers don't take the same kind of approach that I do, because it is easy to get lost in it. and at a certain point you have to pull back and assess and make determinations on what you think happened based on the evidence, and then also the circumstantial evidence. And then when you're looking at these papers as closely as I am, you start to realize where their alliances lay. If they're a house organ for the team, or if they're more likely to be critical of the team, and you have to start balancing all that out. So it gets pretty complicated, but, you know, like I said, particularly with the Red Sox and the Yankees, both of whom I've been writing about for over 20 years, writing their histories, you know, you start to become sensitive to those ebbs and flows of the veracity of information, and, you know, it allows you to kind of cut through and determine what's actually happening.
Now, like I spoke to you earlier, you know, for years, you know, I did the research as a lawyer, and I still do. But like you mentioned to me, you do, you know, you're probably like me. You just research and research and research, and once you are uncovering the layers of onions, you still say to yourself, there's got to be more stuff here somewhere. And you keep digging and digging and digging. And that's where you get caught up. And let me ask you this. When you have your research, do you take notes? Do you keep notes? How do you organize this stuff?
You know, I do take some notes. I make a lot of copies of stories. Like when I'm researching on the old microfilm, I don't read everything as I'm researching. I'm just copying and copying and copying. You know, I try to build a timeline over the time period so I know the events that I need to focus on, so I know the games I need to focus on, and drill down on those, and then I grab as much as possible and I bring it home and I read it. And I try to let the story come out. You know, I have a rough idea where I'm going, but I try to let the story come out organically from all the material I acquire. And then, you know, some people know exactly what they're going to write before they write it. I'm not one of those people. I find that my actual best thinking comes when I'm writing. So when I sit down to write a chapter, I might think it's going to go one way, but as I start writing and I start encountering questions that I think need to be answered, then I'll go down that rabbit hole and try to answer that question. There was a newsletter last week that actually highlighted something from the Ruth book that, you know, when I read it, I was like, gee, I almost forget writing this. But somewhere in the book I talk about the impact that electricity had on the game of baseball. Because before the teens, baseball didn't have a whole lot of competition as a leisure time activity for spectators. You had the Nickelodeon, and that was about it. But with the spread of electricity in the early part of this century, by the late teens, you had movie theaters, you had recorded music, you started having all this competition for your leisure time coming from all these different places. So in a sense, baseball had to adapt and change to keep up with these changes, to counteract them, because, hey, you know, in 1905, you couldn't go to the movies with the same ease that you could in 1919. So, you know, and I read this selection that they pulled out and put in this newsletter that went to about 250,000 people, and I was like, oh, wow, I'd even forgotten that I'd written that, but it's true. That's actually what had taken place at the time. But that's just an example of one of those things that I encountered while writing a chapter and trying to explain, well, why did baseball go down in popularity in the teens? Well, there's some economic factors and everything, but it was electricity. You know, you could go out at night. You know,
right?
You weren't confined to just going to a ball game in the late afternoon and then going home. You had other options. So baseball suddenly had to compete against the movies, against recorded music, and against the fact that you could now sit in your home at night with all the lights on and read. So that changed everything. You had the automobile. People could go places. They couldn't really go places before. So on the weekends, baseball had to compete with the fact that now you could get in your car and you could go to the beach. It was a different era. But it's instructive because it allows you to see things that were not readily apparent once you start factoring in all this outside information. It all has to be done in the cultural context of what's going on in the time. And in this book, what's going on during that time period is not only what I just mentioned, but also the impact of World War I and the impact of the Spanish influenza, which were two devastating events that happened back to back. And in a sense, I think they explain the Roaring '20s, a time period where people wanted to forget, where they wanted to be entertained, where they wanted to be wowed, where you had a generation of younger people who had seen nothing but death while growing up, and they wanted something positive, something enjoyable. And then you had this fabulous character of Babe Ruth, who seemed to epitomize the era. He was out for fun. He enjoyed himself. He was doing things that had never been done before. And people were really attracted to that.
Do you think, because both Boston and New York were in competition long before the Babe, and people don't realize it's not necessarily in baseball, but also the building of the first subway. There was a book written a few years ago.
Sure, yeah, economically and culturally, along with Philadelphia, those were the three cities that were kind of vying for prominence. And, it did kind of, in a sense, boil down to New York and Boston because there were cultural differences in the cities, Boston being, the more conservative city back then, New York being the commercial center. So there was that natural rivalry that was built into it that baseball had always tried to take advantage of, but really never had until Ruth kind of made those differences stand out in relief. One of the points I make in the book is that, in Boston, I don't think they'd have ever allowed Babe Ruth to be Babe Ruth the same way that he was allowed to be himself in New York. New York is a city that kind of celebrates excesses, and it's also a place where a celebrity can be anonymous. And in Boston, Ruth was a big fish in a small pond. Everything he did bad was known and whispered about, and he was tisked at for his bad behavior over and over again. In New York, they didn't care. So that was a perfect place for him, just on a cultural and personal level, to go to, because in New York he could be himself. In Boston, he was always, grinding up against a different moral universe, so to speak.
Do you think, because Colonel Rupert really needed Babe Ruth because Prohibition was on the horizon here, and he made his money with his brews, and of course he was able to put boards all over the polo grounds and all this stuff. But did he see Babe Ruth as now this is going to be the moneymaker for him? I
think he saw that there was that possibility. Ruth had in 1918 and 1919, while a member of the Red Sox, he had been nowhere more successful than in the Polo Grounds when the Red Sox played the Yankees. That was a ballpark that was made for him, and the crowds responded to him in New York like they did nowhere else either. And I think Rupert looked at that, realized that, with the onset of Prohibition, baseball was going to have to be his big business. He had to compete against the Giants, arguably the dominant team of the era. Certainly they had the dominant figure in John McGraw. He needed something to happen to make the Yankees competitive. And Ruth had shown that he could draw crowds. And yes, it was something of a risk. You could not guarantee that he was going to continue to perform at the plate at the level that he had been. You could not guarantee that his personal behavior wasn't going to leave him in the gutter in 2 or 3 years. But, Rupert was at a point in his business life where, he either had to challenge the Giants on the field for fans in New York, or die. The Yankees needed their own ballpark. The Giants were starting to put the screws on them and starting to talk about how we don't want to rent out Polo Grounds to you anymore. Let you die. They didn't care. And Rupert needed to survive. So he was in the position where he could take a chance and where he needed to take a chance because there really was no other option for him.
And let me ask you this. Miller Huggins was a no-nonsense coach, but yet he had up with Ruth's, his personality, his late-night drinking, the womanizing, and Ruth was fine all through the times. But how do you think Ruth and Huggins were able to get together and at least make this a successful leap from, the Red Sox to the Yankees and make it work?
Well, I think, Huggins was smart enough to know what he had in Ruth, to know that he was a special player. And, special players, sometimes you have to treat a little differently. They simply reached an accommodation. I think it helped, too, that by the time Ruth got to New York, even though he was still a man of excesses, that he was also a little older and a little bit more mature. And by that point, he'd learned that he, too, had to make some accommodations. In Boston, and I had an old-timer tell me this years ago who'd worked for the Red Sox, that they would actually, at times, pay Ruth on a per diem basis because otherwise he'd spend all his money, and that they would send players out sometimes in the morning to check behind brothels and bars in Boston to see if they could find him, because Ruth would drink and whore and pass out, in an alley somewhere. And, by the time he went to New York, he'd settled down a little bit. And he'd also reached a level of financial security and stature that he didn't have to go looking for the nightlife quite so much. It came to him. And that was a big change, too. I mentioned in the book that, once Ruth got to New York, the writers couldn't believe it, but there'd be a party in Ruth's apartment every night, and they could go to it, and so could just about anybody else. It's like the old baseball story is that what Billy Martin would tell the Yankees, they weren't allowed to drink in the hotel bar. Only he was allowed to drink in the hotel bar. That kept Billy from getting in too much trouble. Well, Ruth, by the time he got to New York, he kept his carousing in-house rather than going elsewhere for it, and that was a big change.
You mentioned earlier in the broadcast, when you start a project, you make hey, I don't know nothing on the subject. The truth, right, through my research. What were some of the things that you found out about Ruth that you didn't know about?
Well, one of the big things is some of what I've actually talked about was how he swung the bat, and how it had been talked about really from the time he first joined the Red Sox, how, during batting practice and even when he got to bat during the games, that he didn't swing like other people did. From the beginning, he swung from the heels. He'd watched Brother Matthias and Brother Herman at the home in Baltimore, and they would hit fungos, one-handed fungos, and try to hit him over the wall. And that's what he wanted to do. And as a pitcher, when he went into professional baseball, no one told him to change his style of hitting. He was trying to hit the ball far. He was trying to hit it hard. Nobody else was. And because he was a pitcher, they indulged him with that. And, occasionally he would get a really long hit. The rest of the time he wasn't particularly productive as a hitting pitcher. But by the mere fact that they left him alone from 1915, 1916, 1917, by the time he reached his fourth year in the major leagues, he was starting to figure it out. He was a great athlete. He had great hand-eye coordination, and he was starting to figure it out, and he was starting to he figured out that he could duplicate this, that he could actually try to hit home runs. I don't think anybody else in baseball at that time period had tried to hit home runs. They were considered accidents. Great when they happen, but God, don't try to hit one because you're going to strike out. Well, Ruth was a pitcher, and it didn't really matter if he struck out because although some pitchers could hit that back then, even then, most of them were not looked at to contribute much at the plate. Hey, if you could bunt, great. But there was a reason that almost without exception that hitters still batted at the bottom of the order, or pitchers still batted at the bottom of the order. But, so Ruth was allowed to evolve without somebody telling him to change. And then suddenly when he started having results on the field, well, then nobody tried to change him because look how many people came out to watch him hit. People would start to come out to the ballpark early just to see him take batting practice. And, with Ruth, it was almost as exciting seeing him swing and miss as it was seeing him connect. So that's something that really surprised me because I'd never really processed how different he was as a hitter for his time period and how that happened. But when you start to read accounts of him in his early years taking batting practice and, not doing what the other players were doing, basically, you start to put it together.
History, ever since that trade, and I've lived in New York City for the first 23 years of my life. I've been up here in Massachusetts for the last 24 years when I went to law school. History sees this as a lopsided trade.
Right, and that's from today's perspective. During that time, and that's something that's also very important to look at. During the time the trade was made, it was sort of the sale was made. It was sort of considered a wash. Boston had it with Ruth in a lot of ways, and I'm not just talking the team. I'm talking the fans and much of the press. He had jumped the team. He had not shown up for games. He'd been suspended. He'd gotten into fights. He was a handful. And, they started to look at him, and it was like he might not be around for very long, He might not be able to sustain this hitting because, all of his hitting in 1918 and 1919 tended to happen over relatively brief periods. So in a sense, it made a lot of baseball sense that here's a guy who's burning the candle at both ends, who just had a great year, but not one we're sure he can duplicate, and who, by the way, hasn't really been pitching as well as he had been pitching in previous years. So maybe it was a chance to, I think for the Red Sox perspective, it was a chance to sell him at the highest price possible when his value was the highest. And then, of course, which is I get into in some detail in the book, there were all sort of political ramifications going on in the league at the time. Ban Johnson, the president of the American League, didn't want Harry Frazee to own a franchise in the first place and was determined to force him to sell the team anyway, which put some, temporary financial pressures on Frazee. Frazee built alliances against Johnson with the Yankees and with the White Sox. He was the first guy to suggest a commissioner system because Johnson almost botched the 1918 season and caused it to be canceled because he wanted players to be able to avoid the draft, which really cost baseball with public opinion. So there was a lot of other stuff going on, and I kind of process it all. And, the end, and, you put it into the sausage maker, and at the end it comes out that, it made a lot of sense at the time. And, no one at the time really talked about, Harry Frazee, raping the Red Sox or anything like that. It was on par, seen as a relatively equitable deal. It looked like Frazee got a good price. It looked like he was going to, reinvest in the team, and it looked like the Yankees were taking a huge chance. Now, in a relatively short period of time, it became clear that that chance the Yankees took paid off, but there was certainly no guarantee of that when they made the purchase.
One of the things I found I mean, I knew about it, but I always find amusing. It was like party time during spring training. It wasn't this,
Oh, sure.
like we have it today. And I'm sitting there like, my God, people think that, you go there but how do you try to lure Ruth, who had the whole winter off? God knows how big he got over the winter with his belly, because, he's an over-life character, broad shoulders, big belly. But spring training was party time. It wasn't what it is today.
There's a reason why they went to places like Hot Springs, Arkansas. Players, you needed to entice them to spring training. And a place like Hot Springs, which was a gambling mecca, and there were brothels everywhere and racetracks and things like that, that was easy to entice players. Same thing when the Yankees later went to Tampa. It was a place where players could have fun because, they were only going to work out a couple hours a day. Most of spring training back then consisted of, you'd warm up a little in the morning and you might play an exhibition game, and then maybe you'd go for a long walk. And that only took 2 or 3 hours. And you had to do something the rest of the time. So, if you're at a nice warm place where there's lots of girls and lots of booze and lots of gambling, that kept players entertained and would get them to come down, because you couldn't really force the players to come down in the same way you can today. There was no agreement that forced them to report on a certain date. So you had to entice them to come down and get them to stay and actually put in some of the work and get ready for the season.
And you know what else strikes me in a time where, of course, you have the reserve clause well into the 1970s. Players after World War I were getting nickeled and dimed worse than they were.
Yeah. They baseball had taken a financial beating, not only because attendance had been down, but you had the challenge of the Federal League that at the same time caused salaries to go up because suddenly there was competition for players. So in the wake of all that, and then World War I, where the 1918 season was drastically affected. In fact, both in 1918 and 1919, they didn't play a full schedule of games. They played fewer games than they had in previous years. That put the squeeze on, and the baseball magnates, being the capitalists they were, responded by really squeezing the players financially. So salaries went down, and the number of players on the rosters went down. And, it was a tough way to make a living. And, but you had a guy, Ruth, who, for whatever reason, kind of saw through the shenanigans and was like, hey, I'm the one getting people to come out to the ballpark. Give me more money. So in a sense, he was, and even at that, even though he was getting, an exorbitant amount of money for the time, I think in 1920 he was getting $20,000 a year. The Yankees ended up drawing 1 million fans in 1920, just in New York. And that was solely because of Ruth. I mean, that's the year that he really exploded on the scene with home runs, and no matter where the Yankees would play, fans would come out in droves to see them. And, Ruth earned the Yankees hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, even though he was, essentially the best paid player in the game at the time. He was still woefully underpaid. And it's interesting, historically to see that it basically took the players and through the players union, it basically took, Marvin Miller and another 50 years for the players to realize this, that, no baseball owner has ever gone bankrupt overpaying players. And that's something that's true to this day. For as much as the players get paid, the money's out there. Nobody's ever put a gun to ownership's head and forced them to pay. And as long as the ballparks are filled, and as long as the ratings can support the exorbitant amounts of money that cable franchises pay for rights to broadcast baseball, the players are still, only getting a little less than their fair share because baseball is very, very profitable.
You know, it's funny what you mentioned Marvin Miller, because I got my third show coming up next week. Author Krista Swanson wrote the book on how the players turned the tides on the management, and I've had 2 shows already, and I'm going to have a third show. And I also got a bit of cup of coffee coming up later on about the players that were not grandfathered in, who are in their 70s and 80s, who aren't being taken care of. They don't have I speak to one of them, Jimmy Driscoll. He's up in New Hampshire. But
right.
this is what I want to say. Back then in the Roaring '20s, no one really complained about this because all the complaining was done, I think, during the time of the teens, and then when the Roaring '20s came, you didn't hear it. But I think Joe DiMaggio was the first one to literally sit out of spring training and challenge the Rupert to get paid more than
Well, not only that, but Ruth was the first guy to actually have an agent and to try to maximize, his not only his earning on the field, but his earning off the field. He had a guy in Boston named Johnny Igo who had his ear, who was always telling him that there was more money to be made. And then, of course, when he got to New York, he falls in with Christy Walsh, who, sees that Ruth is, making peanuts to write to have a ghost written column, and tells him, hey, I can get you a lot more money for this kind of stuff. So, but the players in general, the big reason I think that that en masse they didn't try to do anything about this is their careers were so short. The average guy only had 3 or 4 years in the major leagues, and many of them were on the margins. There was no guarantee they were going to have a job at all. And another factor in that is, at the turn of the century, the life expectancy was only in the upper 40s. So guys weren't thinking long term. It was get what I can get now, rather than take a chance and risk the fact that I won't get anything. And that's how they had to think. It was very, very different era.
Yeah, compared to the day, the players pretty much have the leverage now because they know that, like Ruth, I'm the one that they're coming out to see. You're making the money off of me.
Yeah, exactly. And back then, there was no, management was pretty much united. If you gave them trouble, it was like, fine, we'll get somebody else. Go ahead. There's 100 other guys who want your job. Go ahead, we'll do it.
Yeah.
And periodically they would. You really had no leverage. You were a well-paid slave. You could only play for one team. Although Ruth, pushed the envelope with that by jumping the club a couple of times and playing exhibition games for other teams, where you could make $500. And that's one of the funny things. It's like, why did the other players put up with Ruth's behavior? And it's like, well, in a lot of ways, when he would do things like that, I think they would look at him and go, I wish I could do that. They kind of saw that Ruth kind of saw through the charade of the finances of the game. And I think that's one of the reasons they put up with it, even though he was at times a total pain in the butt. And, at times by jumping the club, it would hurt them. They also realized that, they didn't have any power. And if you could get something more, who's going to say not to?
Let me ask you this. This will be my last inquiry, but it's a very important one. I loved your 15 points, and I keep going back to this, about writing a book. And probably the biggest one that comes up to me is ass and chair. Let me say this again. Ass and chair. You don't get anything done going for coffee every hour. Most of the time, the job is ass and chair. You're a writer when asked at the bar, but the rest of the time, it's ass and chair. you're not a tortured artist. You're a day laborer, like the people waiting for assignments from Manpower. Let me ask you this. Do you do all your research first and then write to from the chair? Or chapter by chapter and do it that way and piece it together?
Well, I do a lot of research before I start to write, and then as I'm writing, I will discover things that I need to do more research on, and then I'll go do that research. But I try to do the heavy lifting of research in advance. I don't want to have to stop writing and then take a trip somewhere. So like, for instance, with the Ruth book, I went down to Texas. I spent almost 4 full days at the Ransom Center. I grabbed a lot of stuff. I had a lot of clippings. So hopefully in that first major sweep of research, I get most of what I need. And then when I get into the actual writing, if then I realize there are any gaps, it's usually the kind of stuff I can fill in, online through some newspapers or things like that. I don't want to have to stop and then go someplace and do it. I will if I have to, but I might get to a point where I realize, I need to go back down to Boston, spend another day in the library, because I just discovered there's this game or this incident that I don't know enough about, and there's no other way to do it. So, I'll keep a list of stuff like that and then try to maybe go out and do some deep research, secondary research again. But, you're right. It is just a matter of getting all your stuff together and sitting down there. And, the best motivator to ever get a book done is that you have a deadline and you have to hit it. And that's why you got to get your rear end in the chair. It's the story I tell is that my daughter, who's 20 now, and I've worked at home I've been full-time doing this at home since 1993. And, of course, she doesn't see me actually write. And when she was younger, people would ask her, what does your dad do? And she would say, he talks on the phone. Because that's what she would actually see me doing, because the actual act of writing is something that you do, locked away in your office in the basement or wherever it is.
That's fantastic, because, I'm probably going to come to you for a lot more advice. This has been great. Let me ask you this question. Did I forget anything that maybe the folks at home should know about the Babe?
Well, I think it does give somewhat of an alternate take on Ruth in that it is critical of him. But I try to make the point that even though it's critical of Ruth, that it's important to keep in mind that his teammates still liked him. He was a royal pain in the butt. He was frustrating as hell, but he was impossible not to like because he was guileless. It wasn't like he had an angle or anything. He was just being himself. And I think that's, Ruth is a real individual. And, he was the son of immigrants, and he was kind of an everyman for that era in regard to that because, he was a street urchin who pulled himself up by his bootstraps. And that's a very American story. Yet he was still an individual, and this is a country that gives a lot of lip service to an individual, but doesn't quite always know what to do with one when it finds one. But in Ruth, you see the justification for letting someone be themselves. Because the worst thing that ever could have happened to Babe Ruth is if someone ever would have tried to confine him and tried to make him adhere to the norms and try to make him conform. You only get change, you only get evolution in a creative process. And by accident, by circumstance, Ruth was allowed to incubate as a player in a creative environment. And, that's how he got to be someone else. That's how he went from being George Herman Ruth into becoming the Babe, someone who's known even to this day by that singular name. You say the word, oh, I'm writing about the Babe, everybody knows what you're talking about.
And let me ask you this, one final question. I had Charlie Learson on my show a few years ago with his book on Ty Cobb. And I told Mr. Learson, I said, your book is going to be quoted from as the major source for Ty Cobb because of the research you put into it. It's revisionist history. Do you see these two years of what you've done and how striking this book is that we should consider it revisionist?
Well, I don't know if it's revisionist as much as it's simply because I think revisionist is you kind of take the same information, you come with a different conclusion. I think what I did, and I think what the other gentleman did, is actually came up with new information. That's not revisionist. That's just taking it forward. I mean, I look at it this way. History is cumulative. It changes over time as new information is uncovered or new insights are created. 10, 15 years from now, somebody might, if they find the evidence, they might write a book that says, I'm full of crap. And that's fine if that happens, as long as it's based in fact and as long as it's based in research. Because, the story of history always changes based on the information you have. So it's not revisionist, it's evolutionary. It changes over time based on the information you have, based on the context of your culture that you're writing from, and based on the experience of the readers themselves.
And besides Amazon and Barnes and Nobles, where can we find the selling of the Babe?
You can go to any bookstore in the country and they can order it for you. Support your independent booksellers. They're the ones that keep us all going. You can get the book on Kindle, all that stuff. It's still out there. It's still in print, and hopefully will be for a while.
And let me ask you this, something, I know you mentioned something on Facebook the other day. What's your next project?
My next project is going to be another big comprehensive team history on the order of Red Sox century and Yankees century. Only this time it's going to be about a football team. It's going to be about the New England Patriots.
Oh, wow. Oh, by the way, today,
pardon me?
Adrian Peterson, running back.
Right. That'll be in there. And I'm actually looking forward to it because people haven't done the kind of history of football teams the way that I've done the history of baseball teams. And I'm looking forward to, approaching the Patriots because it also gives me an opportunity to write about every big issue that's come up in football over the last 60 years, which is, in a sense, you get to tell the entire history of the NFL. And I think it's going to be successful because, people know at this point that when I do books like that, I don't write Valentines. I write what actually happened. And as I said earlier in this interview, I think the truth always tells the best story. And in terms of the Patriots, despite their recent success, even the most hardcore Patriots fan doesn't know a whole lot about their history. So it'll be fun to get into that. And I'm sure that when I'm done with that book, there'll be lots of stuff that I had no idea was there when I started. But that I'll uncover along the way, and that might prove surprising and entertaining to not just Patriots fans, but to football fans or just fans of history.
A lot of people don't know they were called the Boston Patriots to begin with, and I think it changed around 71.
Yeah, they were called the Boston Patriots, and in fact, at one time, briefly, they were called the Bay State Patriots.
Yeah.
that didn't work too well. Unfortunately, someone convinced Billy Sullivan, the owner, not to call them the Bay State Patriots, but why don't you call them the New England Patriots? Bay State didn't have a whole lot of resonance, whereas by identifying with the region, I think made the team easier to market.
Oh, it sounds like it's going to be a great book because you're going to go back to the days of Jim Plunkett. A lot of people forget he was on the Patriots before he went to Oakland.
Oh, yeah, when you go back to the days of, one of the great stories of the birth of that team is that, Billy Sullivan, the first owner, was by far the poorest member of what they called the Foolish Club, which were the first owners in the AFL. And to come up with his initial payment, he even broke into his kid's piggy bank. And the end result was a team that was underfunded from the start. That caused all sorts of problems. But that first owner, Billy Sullivan, put his heart and soul into the team and managed to keep them up and afloat until people with money came along and actually were able to make them good. So it's a real interesting story. As one of my friends said to me, or my partner that I'm doing the book with, Richard Johnson, it's like for the first 20 or 25 years of their existence, the Patriots were the Washington Generals, and now they're the New York Yankees.
They are. They certainly are. I said
loved, successful, loved, and in some places hated, and that's just going to be a lot of fun to play with.
When do you anticipate that coming out?
Pardon me?
When do you anticipate the book coming out?
Oh, that book will be out in the fall of 2018.
Well, you got to send it to me, Glenn.
I have to write it. I have to write it by the first of the year, so I'll be very busy for the next the next 7 or 8 months. So I got a lot of work to do.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today because I had a blast with you. And
no, I really did. Thanks. You asked great questions, and as you can tell, I love talking about this stuff. And I hope that people who pick up the book, will enjoy it and come away with knowing some things they didn't know before.
And I think what I'm going to do is I'll probably instant message you probably to get a copy of Fenway 1912. And we'll
okay, yeah, please do because I can do that for you.
Yeah, and so hold the line for a second. This is how I end the show. Folks, as you see, Babe Ruth's history is a mesmerizing topic. Go out, get this book. You're going to learn a lot of new things. Glenn's a fantastic writer, easy on the eyes to read, really clear writing, great research. You can't go wrong with a book like that. I'm in for my partner who's still away on assignment, Marc Weiss, and in for Glenn Stout, and in the immortal words of Edwin R. Morrow. Good night, folks, and good luck.